Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mike McCormick with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills, Maryland. Today is March 1st, 2018. Today's video is a follow-up in reference to the video I released yesterday dealing with the possible suicide of Detective Sean Suter. I received a lot of feedback from you guys, and it was a lot of feedback that I didn't really feel like typing in terms of comments because it would have taken me a long time to explain a couple of questions that you guys had. So in this video here, what I'm going to do is also explain a part of the video that you guys never saw in terms of the way that the editing was done on that particular video. You did not get the first 5 minutes of that video, and certainly would have helped out with some of the questions that you guys had. So today's video is in reference to Detective Suter possibly taking his life, and I'm going to lay out what my theory is what I'm doing. And always remember, it's my theory, just based upon some of the things that I've learned from inside the police department, outside the police department, and other personal research that's been conducted. Again, until we find what happened to the detective, then we all, have the ability to come up with the theories that we think that we can support. And I think that my theory, once I lay it out to you, has some validity and has some support. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that I talk to investigative reporters all the time who generally have sources inside the police department. And some of the sources inside the police department that were reported as recently as December 8th, if you guys go back and you bring up the Sun report by Ian Duncan, in terms of their interview with the Commissioner Davis at that time, there were a couple theories. And one of the theories that the police department indicated was that the possibility existed that Detective Suter had taken his life, or it could have been an accidental death. These things were talked about inside the police department, according to the reporter who did that particular investigation. So when I tell you certain things, it's because I'm getting this information from published reports. And then I'm going to compare it to what we've researched and some other things that I've heard from what I would consider to be reliable sources. And at that point, you can make your own determination as to whether or not you agree or disagree, because that's what this channel is all about, whether we're going to disagree or agree. And oftentimes, I'm very happy that I see some of the comments that I get, because most of you guys are familiar with this case. You follow a lot of what's going on, but I'm going to try to give you some information that you probably would never get and that I have gotten or I have heard about, and I think that information is valid. Okay, until it can be substantiated that it's not valid. And so that's what I try to, to certainly get across to you guys when you're listening to this particular channel. So one of the concerns I got, one of the comments I got had to do with Detective Suter being married. I think there was a misunderstanding because you guys never got the first part of yesterday's video. If you go back and play that video, you'll see as soon as you come into that video, I'm already talking. You see what I'm saying? I'm already talking in that video, which means that you guys missed probably about 5 minutes. Poor editing on my part, so I apologize. And so that's why I'm back on the day. So one of the things that came up was about Detective Suter being married. Of course, I know that the detective was married. He's married to Nicole Suter. What point I was trying to make in reference to that particular case was that he was married before, where he had an absolute divorce from Chantel Carol Suter, which was back in 2003. And this is in the court record for AA County. And then I came back and I also said that there was a second case that was in PG County, where he had child support was filed against him, and he decided that he needed to have a child support modification, which happens all the time with guys with child support, where at some point it gets to be a little too much, or the officer's not making enough money, or an individual's not making enough money to actually pay the full amount, and they'll petition the court for a reduction if it can be warranted in a particular case. And so these things exist, and they're in the court record. So I don't need to tell you anymore. You can research that for yourself. So I wanted to talk about that. So I didn't want, when I said that he was divorced, I didn't mean that he was divorced at the time of his death. So I think there was a misconception as to what I meant. So I wanted to straighten that out. Let's see, what else here? Someone told me that they don't think I should personally make a video like this. Let me tell you something. I've been in criminal justice a long time, and anything dealing with criminal justice, it doesn't matter to me who is involved in it either way. I'm going to report about it. I'm going to give my personal opinion about it. And you know what? The best thing about this particular channel, any channel on YouTube, is that you can either listen or you don't have to listen. You can either subscribe or you don't have to subscribe. At the end of the day, I'm going to report what I think needs to be reported and talked about. And I do appreciate all of your comments. This is why I get right back to you guys on this channel. So, you know, it is what it is. And I'm going to continue to report about the things that I think are very important when it comes to policing in America, the court system in America, as well as corrections. And I don't take what I do personal with anybody that's involved in the system. Quite naturally, I do have a feeling for this particular situation because I don't like how the police department, always remember, the case has gotten as far as it's gotten with nothing involved because the police department has done everything possible not to give us information in order to make an educated decision about how we feel about how this detective was killed. Always remember that. It's not me, it's the information that we haven't got. And there's plenty of information that we haven't got. And that's why investigative reporting exists, to go behind the scenes to find out what was done here, what was done there, why wasn't this done, you know, everything. And so that's why it's important that you guys, you know, say, okay, well, you know, we don't want to listen to Mike. Well, I appreciate it if you do listen to Mike, but at the same time, I understand if you have certain personal feelings that you don't feel what I'm saying should be talked about. It's always going to be talked about. And I'm going to leave it at that. So you guys stay tuned because I'm always going to talk about criminal justice issues. Again, this whole case is shrouded in police secrecy. You know that just simply because of how the police department has operated in the past 20 years. We know that simply because of the justice report that was published, 177 pages, about how the police department does not do thorough investigations. Not only in homicide, and they included that, not only in homicides, but also in dealing with reports of misconduct. So we know that this particular police department is subjected themselves to this kind of inquiry. And this is what I'm doing. I'm making an inquiry as to what happened to that detective. And that's where we are with this. Let me look at some of the other comments that were made. And you guys, you kind of know who you are. I just don't want to mention your names, but you know who you are when I respond back to you. Someone asked me about the autopsy report and audio tape. I certainly did hear the audio tape. Okay, the couple seconds that it was. I certainly did. I did not see the autopsy report, but I've talked to people that have. Okay, so when I tell you, and I made motion that the detective was shot in the back of the head on the right-hand side, Detective Suda was right-handed. Okay, and it's not far to believe that someone can take a handgun and put it to the back of their own head and kill themselves. Okay, there are studies, there are actual cases of people killing themselves and suicides in that way. There are police officers who have staged their own suicides. I'm not making this up. I have researched it. And again, we can always go offline. If you guys really have some serious inquiries to me where you want me to pull up some research, send it to you, then we have an email address. And by all means, just go ahead and shoot me an email, right? And I'll go ahead and give you all the attachments necessary, or at least give you the link ups so you can look at it for yourself. And so I'm not just sitting here putting out information that I don't feel is necessary to kind of collectively, again, I'll use the word collectively, make a decision one way or the other. Or, you know, so that's what I want to do. And I think that you guys kind of understand that. We don't have all the information. Of course, this is another person asked me about having all the information. No, we're not going to have all the information. What we're trying to do is piece together this case. Let me see. What else? Someone asked me. Right, and one of my last subscribers asked me, and it was important, says, did you know that your audio cut out from the beginning? Well, no, I found out last night, and so this is why I'm back on today, so I can give you more material that you didn't get yesterday. Someone asked me that they said this is the first time that they've heard about this particular suicide theory. Well, the suicide theory started kind of like the first week of the homicide out there. Let me see. Someone says that what is the evidence to hard to believe that he killed himself? Well, I'm going to lay this out very shortly in the same video to you guys. Let me see. Someone has indicated that this would be the worst suicide plan of ever. Well, there's no perfect suicide plan. I will tell you that now. Just recently, a couple years ago, you had a detective. He was an awarded detective in Chicago who actually planned his suicide, kind of in similar fashion, where he had called over his radio for assistance. He had said that a couple guys were chasing him, and he had fired off a couple of rounds so that the radio could hear that was in fact going on. And in fact, after 3 or 4 months after the investigation, they were able to find out that it was a suicide plan. Okay, so it's not like these things do not happen. I also want to explain to you guys, and I think you didn't hear this before, but in approximately every murder of a police officer in the United States, through just regular means of contact with criminals and things like that, where officers' life is taken, we tend to think that those are the most crimes committed against police. But in fact, most deaths that occur with police officers are suicide, and that's nationally. And so you can Google those things. The things I'm giving you, I'm not sitting here playing a guessing game. These things are easy for you guys to find out. So yeah, the #1 killer of police officers is suicide, whether it's line of duty or non-line of duty. So I wanted to bring that up to you guys. Okay. Someone also said about me making the video, they didn't like the fact that I made the video because it didn't have all the facts, and they believe, again, this is a value judgment, they believe he wouldn't have done this to themselves. And so that tells me, because I don't know you guys personally, so that tells me that some of you guys either knew Detective Suter or kind of close to him, and perhaps his family. And I'm not looking at it from that point of view. I did not know the detective, and even if I did, I would certainly have to remove myself from a value judgment and look at what's out there and try to collectively come together to figure out, what happened to this detective, one way or the other. Whether, and the 3 theories that you guys know that are out there is either that he was killed by someone from the gun squad, set up and killed up in that area as a hit. The other theory was that he ran up on a perpetrator that they had saw earlier, and that perpetrator overpowered him and took his weapon and fired rounds. Or the third theory that was there, again, the police department had put this theory out, that he planned his suicide. And so that's what's out there. And I'm going to address all 3 because you guys just didn't see it. So I wanted to get back to some of you guys here. I'm looking at my phone at the same time I'm talking to you guys about some of the comments that you made. Okay. And okay, and they're very, very, very good and interesting comments that you guys made. Okay, but I wanted to clear it up, though, particularly about the divorce. And I think because you didn't hear the first part of the video when it came to the divorce part, you guys just didn't know that he was divorced prior with another woman back in 2003 and not his wife now. Okay, so let's get into this particular video in terms of what we want to look at. Okay, so one of the things that we need to look at is a motive. So let's talk about a motive for the gun trace task force. Now, we know that the detective was shot on November 15th, 2017. We know that he was determined to be brain dead noon on November 16th, 2017. Okay, now, what the theory was, the first theory that's been out there, was that since officers were on trial from the gun trace task force, that they in fact had him murdered. One of the major problems and why that fell through for me was that, for a couple reasons why. The first is that at least 4 to 5 officers had already pled guilty in this case. The FBI had already talked to them in this case. The federal government had already talked to these guys in this case. You had to know that after the detective was killed, that the federal government would have gone to every single prison where these guys were being housed at with their investigators and started asking them questions about this officer's death. None of those officers ever used or said to detectives, in this case here from the FBI, that they in fact knew about a hit, were a part of a hit. My contention was, had I been sitting in prison and I had that kind of information and the FBI approached me and asked me whether or not I knew about a hit, and I knew that that all would hinge on my reduction of a sentence because these guys are going to get a lot of time, I certainly would have brought that up. None of these detectives in the gun trace task force ever brought that up. None of them. So that was kind of the first clue for me that, in fact, they were not involved in this particular murder of the detective. The second thing I looked at was that these guys, they've been incarcerated ever since last year, early part of last year, I believe March of last year when the indictments came down, 2017. So they've been housed in a federal penitentiary, right, where there is not the kind of contact you guys would probably think that there is. There isn't. So you don't have the same kind of contact you would at the state level in a federal prison. Not to mention that all of the mail, not to mention that all of the conversations that they would have on telephone are being closely monitored. You got to know that these conversations were closely monitored, and there's no conversations that were ever recorded by the federal government that indicate that there was a murder plot out on Detective Suiter's life. You got to know that when the second indictment came down for Sergeant Jenkins, that already two partners of his had already gone to the FBI and implicated him in the planning of drugs, long before Detective Suiter was even called to be a witness. This is how the indictment came down 15 days later. It was even talked about through Jennings of the federal prosecutor's office, and he said, we didn't need Detective Suiter's testimony on this case here. His testimony would have just been icing on the cake, simply meaning that the first two officers out of the four officers who were on the scene of that particular investigation back in 2010, those officers already gave federal information about Jenkins's involvement with the planting of narcotics on the 28th of April 2010. Okay, so that right there in and of itself told me kind of much all I really needed to know in that case, because when you look at it, there is no motivation at this point for the gun trace task force to kill him, because several guys have already pled guilty. Two decided to go to trial. And the reason they got found guilty, because as you guys know, I was at the trial, they got found guilty because four officers from the gun trace task force came to court and testified against them. So that's how they went to jail. They didn't go to jail because Detective Suiter was a threat to either case. So that ruled that out for me in my mind, and it made sense. Let's see. Okay, let's get to the unknown assailant. That's the other theory that was out there. Well, the unknown assailant, in my estimation, now this goes to, when I talk about this, I'm talking about it from a police perspective of how criminals tend to act on the streets. If you haven't been a cop, you haven't worked high crime area, you haven't been around guys and how they do their business in terms of how they operate on the streets, this might sound a little foreign to you. But typically, in situations like this, if I have a warrant out for my arrest, if I have drugs on me or anything like that, I am not going to stay up in an area where I have been visibly observed by two officers in a plainclothes unit who saw me 20 minutes earlier. I'm going to get out that area, because I also know that there are MARC units that are going to be up in that area riding around too. That's the last thing I want to see. And so in my mind, again, I'm thinking like the criminals typically think on the street. They don't stay around areas too long. As soon as they spot police officers, if they are in fact wanted for something, have done something recently, they're going to get out the area. What did not, and it still doesn't make sense, and for some reason or other, I want you guys to understand this, that police officers are professional in terms of identification. The identification that was given for this suspect was a generic identification typically you would get from someone who was robbed for the very first time, that they were in that much shock that they could not identify someone. The main problem on hurdle for me in this particular case had to do with his partner, Detective Bamenka, not being able to give a clear and more definitive description of a suspect that they saw not once, but according to Detective Bamenka, twice. Okay, the police department, and again, here we go, back to the police department. The police department has failed to give the citizens of Baltimore any information regarding Detective Bamenka's observations, what conversations him and Suda might have had prior to. None of that have we gotten. Okay? And one of the major things you need to ask yourself, if you've been following this case, you need to ask yourself, why haven't, after we were promised back in November by Commissioner Davis, why is it now that the new commissioner, why is it now that some of the command staff, they refuse to give us a copy and let us see that film from the surveillance camera of a residential house in that 900 block of Bennett Street? We were told on national TV, on local TV, by Commissioner Davis that that particular video showed Detective Bamenka running across the street for cover. Well, if it's an innocent video, as it appears to be, then that's something that we certainly the public should have been able to see. Again, I will tell you why the video was so important, and then you'll see where I'm going. If the video, most surveillance videos, particularly home videos, pretty much run 24/7. We need to see what was going up in the 900 block, what was going on rather, in the 900 block of Bennett Place prior to the officers coming up in that area. We need to see what and how Detective Bamenka acted when he heard the first round go off. Okay? That stuff is so important. We need to compare the radio communication from Suter, okay, and the time frames in which Detective Bamenka responded to give him aid. All of these time frames are so important, particularly the closeness of the time frames are so important. Okay? That would tell you whether or not how long a struggle might have lasted. Okay? Because we can probably see the two detectives up in the area. You know, we would love to see Detective Suter, walking around a corner into that area. I would love to see that. That's available. Okay, so these are the things that we need to see, and yet we were promised that, and we never got it. And if you notice, keep in mind, you don't hear the new commissioner saying anything in reference to this case. They are keeping a lid on this case. You got to keep asking yourself why. Okay, so when we talked about the unknown assailant, this is the other thing with the unknown assailant. All right. In my mind, if this was a person who was, again, running, away from the law, certainly it would seem to me that he would have gotten out of the area much more quicker, particularly he already recognized that these guys were cops, okay? And if we are to believe that this gentleman was approached by Suter, whether the words were exchanged, and then seconds later, the detective's fighting for his life, and he gets his gun, and Suter's radio is found, according to the police department, Suter's radio was found in his left hand. Okay, this is important about his left hand because Suter was a right-handed officer, all right? Now, quite naturally, and I've had people ask me this question before about why would an officer continue to use the communications if somebody's grabbing his weapon? His two hands would need to be available to keep his weapon being wrestled away from him. And that makes sense. And I will tell you why. In my mind, it makes sense. Because I have arrested people where I have had to have my radio, and I couldn't have my radio in my hand. I literally dropped my radio on the ground and broke it in a couple incidents because I needed both hands at that time to effect an arrest. I wasn't worried about the communication part of things. I was worried about losing my life or getting seriously hurt trying to effect an arrest, and I needed both hands. And so you do, and I know officers have done the same thing, where you can't fight a suspect with just a radio. Now, I will tell you, back in the day, back in the 80s, where I did get into a couple of scrapes, I used the radio as a weapon. I hit a person upside his head with my radio. okay, because I had to get them up off of me. So, the radio, in my mind, is important, but it is not as important as if someone's trying to take away your weapon. And so I just wanted to bring that out to you guys and explain, my portion of that. The identification, I've never been happy with the identification. If you follow me, I've never been happy with that identification by a professional who's been on the department, Detective Dominka, a long time, where all he could ever see was a black jacket and a white stripe. It didn't make any sense to me the day I talked about it on Channel 45, and it don't make any sense to me, going on 4 months later. Okay? Now, let's get to the theory that I'm trying to support and feel as though that there's more information in this area of committing suicide than any other motive for the other two. And it starts off like this. Let's look at the detective himself just for a second. Okay, one of the things when I did the national search and looking at suicides by a police officer, there were common things that ran through each of the suicides that made sense after a while. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was that Detective Suter had a lot of pressure on him simply because he was scheduled to be called in to testify in a case where he really did not know what questions would be asked, and that's important to understand. So he didn't really know what questions were going to be asked. I'm sure they told him, we want to ask you a few things about, your involvement in this particular case where evidence was planted. Okay, so he knew within probably 30 days before he was to attend trial that he would have to testify. One of the questions I would ask is who else knew that he would have to testify in the particular case. Again, we don't know that. So he had a lot of pressure on him. He also had pressure on him because 3 officers who he had worked with from 2007 to 2010 had already pled guilty to police misconduct and were looking at serving a lot of time. Okay, so that had to run through his mind that, well, look, based upon what questions they might ask me, I don't want to put myself in a situation where I'm going to have to talk about what those guys did in reference to conduct committed back then. Because both of them, 2 of the detectives admitted that they were stealing money and selling drugs back then from 2007 to 2010. If you look at the last video, one of the last videos I put out that had to do with the work history and relationships with at least 3 other detectives involved with Detective Suter. Detective Suter was always a senior officer. Senior officer meaning that he had more time on the police department than Detective Ward, than Detective Tariq Edwards, and he had more time than Detective Gondo. So he was always a senior man, in at least 170 cases that I counted. Now, out of those, I break it down in the last video as to, how and when they worked together, these guys. So as much as I am sure that not knowing the detective personally, I can also tell you that at any point, the detective had an obligation within those 175 some odd arrests where his name was on all those documents and where he was there on site when these arrests were made. He certainly knew some of the things that these guys were doing, and he had an obligation to come forth to let the police department know situations that he was actually seeing and being involved in. And there's no documentation, nor did the police department ever report that Detective Suter came forth in those 3 years of working with these guys who ended up being charged in a gun trace task force as persons that had committed crimes back then. It's kind of hard I can't, you might want me to separate the man from the activity, but I can't do it. I can't do it because I worked on the police department, and I can't conceivably see myself working with someone at least 170 arrests, and not know that some of those arrests were not quality arrests, that some of those arrests were unjustified, that in at least some of those cases there was money taken, and there's no way in the world to work with somebody that long on the police department and not know those things are going on. And that's coming from my own personal experience. Okay, this is not something I've read in a book. This is my own personal experience. I worked narcotics for a couple years, okay, and I've worked on the streets. Okay, so I've worked around officers who did things that they weren't supposed to do. So it's to say that, well, he was probably just a guy who got sucked in. He probably did, at some point. But let's not just say about this professional officer, based upon all his accolades that have been given to him, that he in fact would not have known what was going on with these guys. So we'll keep it moving from there. He had financial pressures, I'm sure. He had 5 children, to raise. Okay, and it cost money to do that. I think he was embarrassed of the fact that, he had not come forth early on when this stuff was going on. And at some point, if you don't come forth, you shut up. Because as long as the evidence is not pointing to you, there's no reason for you to even talk. Some people believe in that. Let's see. And I think I told you about who did he talk to, while he was in the department, up to the point that he was going to have to go to court. All right. So those are the things, a couple of things that I wanted to share with you, right? Now, what's not been talked about is, again, I started this discussion a few minutes ago about police suicides in America. And you guys need to know that there is a whole host of information that supports what I'm talking about today. That it just makes sense when you really look at the backdrop of this whole case, and when you look at the statistics that's already been put out there in cases involving corruption. In every major case in America that involved corruption since 1970, there's always been 1, maybe 2 officers that have committed suicide for fear of what would come out of that investigation. And every major one. I look at the Knapp report, the Mullen Commission report, and the list goes on and on of major reports that were done that showed that leading up to some type of trial or having to testify, there have been officers who committed suicide. And some of those same officers, like with Detective Suda, had great careers on the police department. Great careers. And as you all know, most suicides typically are committed in areas where, nobody's around. Okay, and that was an area that was known to the detective. He worked up in the Western District for many years, so that was a secluded area. If he had planned on taking his life, certainly that could have been a location where that could have taken place. They looked at work relationships were very important in these types of cases. And, the FBI never, I think I said this, the FBI never had Detective Suda figured into any of this nonsense with the gun trace task force. And his disciplinary record, which police departments never really talked about the detective's his record, which would have been nice to know, what cases might have been sustained against him, non-sustained or whatever. That's a whole different area of police misconduct, which talks about internal investigations and how it's determined whether or not an officer is guilty or not guilty of violating police policy. Let's see. Oh, and then they did a national profile, and this is important. And I'm going to go down the line. Some of you forgot that the detective was in the military for 6 years, and he served 2 tours of duty in Iraq, and he served from 1992 to 1998 in the Army. Now, in that time, he again had 2 tours in Iraq. He was part of the group of officers, military guys, that never got debriefed for PTSD. That didn't start happening until later in 2000s, just in the beginning of the 2000s series, when it was the Defense Department had military people committing suicide, about 400 a year. And, once it hit the papers that that's what was happening, this is when the PTSD investigation has started occurring. And it was found that these particular soldiers were not getting debriefed when on their way back to America, particularly when it came to the medical side. And so the profile was out there about not only police officers, but former police officers who were also veterans in Iraq. The national profile was 18 years on the police force that they saw on average, where officers had committed suicide. 17 years, and Detective Suda had 18 years. He was shot at point blank range. He had a legal issue coming up. Again, these are the profiles that they talk about. He had a prior allegation of theft with a member of gun squad. The national average is 42 years old when officers commit suicide. Detective Suter is 43. Okay, so those are the things that are out there that quite readily available if you take the time to look online and look up suicides among police officers. You will find the things that I'm just talking about are quite apparent and real. Let's see. Let's go back to the crime scene just for a second, because the crime scene is always important. One of the questions asked by me by one of the subscribers was whether or not did I think the medical examiner would have lied on the medical exam report. No, I don't think so. But remember, a medical examiner's report, a report that can a report that can always be upgraded to some other type of crime. Excuse me, some other type of manner of death. So it came out early that it was a homicide, but that doesn't mean that through investigation that it could come back an accidental death, or it could come back because still in investigation, it come back a suicide. So just because something comes out as a homicide doesn't necessarily make it so. Again, the reporter who I told you about from the Sun had said that insiders meaning inside the police department, right, saw that there was evidence that said it could possibly be a suicide. It's not coming from me. It's coming from a reporter, an investigative reporter. And that report has never been refuted, mind you, by the police department or by the Baltimore Sun. Okay? So let's keep all that in mind. Now, let's see. Again, at the crime scene, we talk about the position of the detective's body. Well, we'll never know that. And we won't know that until they release more information. What we do know is this, is that the day in question, backup officers arrived with their body cams on, and they could actually film the officer himself laying on the ground, clutching his radio, as been reported. Okay, so there is video that shows the condition of that officer, seconds, minutes after he was shot. So the question would be, when evaluating a case from the medical examiner's office, they're going to look at police reports. They're going to look at the crime lab's investigation, forensic investigation of this case. And so it made sense early on that some of the things that the homicide investigators, now this is from guys from Suter's own police department, have put this information in context. And this is why it came up that the detective could have possibly taken his life, because of the homicide scene itself. It lend itself to making that type of evaluation. So it doesn't surprise me that the medical examiner would say it was a homicide, because the case is still under investigation. One of the things that I think we all overlooked was the position of not finding the detective's glasses. The detective wore glasses. We saw that in some of the newsreels of his past appearances on different homicide scenes, particularly on Channel 13. But we did not see, there's no made mention of whether or not glasses were recovered at the scene. Why? These things are important, because glasses, I wear glasses. Somebody grabbing your glasses, you're in a struggle. Certainly would be fingerprints on those glasses if he wore them that day. We don't know. Okay. Let's see, what else do I have here? Okay, so I wanted to come back on because you guys didn't get a lot of that first video, and I'm glad one of these subscribers had notified me that the first part of that video was not, in good shape, to the point where you could kind of understand where I was coming from with this. I would encourage you guys to do a little more research in the suicide area. Even if you don't believe that he committed suicide, just on the strength of educating yourself, just like I did. I educated myself about officer suicide, and see what you come up with, and then see if your perspective changes. If it doesn't, that's okay. It doesn't matter. But at least understand where I'm coming from with this particular video. My name is Mike McCormick. I'm with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills, Maryland, and I look forward to your comments on this subject.